she remains committed to making the American dream a reality for all. A great First Lady, a great United States Senator, a great United States Secretary of State, and next, our Speaker, Michael
Have to pour water on me.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
So when you left state, you said you were going to do beaches and speeches.
Right.
I'm watching television, you've done a lot of speeches.
I've
done any beaches?
Not yet. Not yet. That is yet to come, hopefully later. I was very optimistic about how I could catch up on things like sleep. You know, I hope there's somebody in this crowd working on a substitute for it, but until there is, it seems to be quite necessary. And I'm having a great time. We're around talking to people, listening to what's on their minds, talking about my new book, and waiting to do it. So I'm really very busy. You just have to wait for a while.
All right. So, there's a quote in it that I'm told in that first number of this is a quote by which you have lived quite a life. It's a sentence that John Wesley wrote. It says, "Do all the good you can by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, as long as you ever can." And it's an idealistic admonition because in government you get a chance to do a lot of good, but it is a brutal, very unfortunate place to try to do it. I think you may notice this.
Yes, I have.
So the question is, how do you maintain your idealism in that kind of environment?
That's a great question, Jim, because I want to just briefly say I knew Jim in his prior life as a congressman from Pennsylvania, and when I was working on health care back in 93 and 94, he was truly one of the people that we talked to and we listened to. He was a Republican, but he was a thoughtful and quite engaged participant in trying to figure out what would work. I went to his district with him once. And when you think about how hard the political world is, and you have experience as well, you really have to believe you're doing it for something bigger than yourself, or it can quickly become either soul-killing or just automatic rote work, and both of those are unsatisfying. And so for me, I was raised in a family and a faith that emphasized service, and I see the political work I did, or the advocacy work I did, or the volunteer work I did, and even some of my professional work as a lawyer as part of that ethos of service that summed up in that Wesley statement.
So, you mentioned being a grandmother, and that makes all of us think about what kind of a world we want to leave our children. And on the domestic front, I think it's pretty hard to argue that we have a bigger problem than the debt. Because with the debt, you can't address. When I was talking backstage a little bit, everybody talks about a grand bargain, but the partisanship is so striking that we get nowhere. So if you were in a position to help resolve that kind of issue, where would you go? How do we get to yes on solving our financial crisis?
Well, I think you have to start on rebuilding relationships and trying to establish a basic trust. We can't get to any of these hard political choices, and I write a book about hard choices, so I think a lot about them all the time, both here at home and around the world. Yes, there it is. You cannot get there to have the kind of discussion that we need unless you begin to rebuild relationships. And I think that's number one in priorities. And there was an interesting example of how this could work last fall after the government shut down, which I thought was very unfortunate, and playing around with the idea of defaulting on the debt. There was an agreement reached, and it required the two chairs of the budget committees, one in the House and one in the Senate, to actually come up with a budget. And I think it was fortunate that the chair of the Senate, my friend, and the senator from Washington, Patty Murray, and the chair in the House, Congressman Paul Ryan from Wisconsin, actually began to talk and listen to each other.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm not going to cut your tile. If they had been given this assignment, get a budget done, and they both had showed up in some conference room with phalanxes of staff on big briefing books and began to sort of make demands across the table, I don't know that it would have succeeded. But instead, they did something very old-fashioned, Jim. They had meals together. They had long phone calls where they said, what do you need and how far can you go? And here's what I need and I can't go further than that. And the two of them built up a level of trust so that when they came forth with a budget, which didn't satisfy anybody, it was short term to start with, but also decisions were made that the people on each side of the aisle were not happy with. But it was what is essential in a democracy, a thoughtful compromise to get us through a crisis. The response to it was quite remarkable. Like, how do they do it? How do they make that happen? So I think that's one lesson. And the other I would pull from my husband's presidency, and you probably remember this, all during Bill's presidency, a lot of very hard choices were made. And on things like the budget, trying to move toward more fiscal responsibility, dealing with the government shutdown that happened not once but twice. He never stopped talking to Newt Gingrich, who was then Speaker. In fact, I used to laugh because Newt would be on TV all day saying terrible things about Bill and occasionally about me. And then around 9 o'clock at night, he'd kind of sneak into the White House and they'd start talking to him. And it got so bad, and Jim will recognize this, it got so bad that some of his lieutenants said to him, Newt one day, we can't let you meet with Bill Clinton alone. And in fact, I think it was Dick Armey and Tom DeLay.
I remember Newt came back to the Republican caucus, and he was talking about how charming Bill was. He said, I walk into his office, and I sit down, and I start pounding on my knee. He said, after a few minutes, my eyes start going like this. I start taking out my wallet and saying, how much would you like?
But there is no substitute for that personal contact. And sometimes it starts off, and I had this experience as a senator, working on issues that were important to me. Sometimes it starts off in a very hostile position. And if what you do is just hold your position and hurl rhetorical, arrows at the other person, you're not going to make any progress. You really have to dig into that relationship building in the same as I found when I was representing our country around the world. So when you talk about something as big as the debt, where people are dug in, first of all, I think it's essential once you try to establish some basis for trust, you've got to also establish a base of evidence. People are entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. And you have to work to try to figure out. Now, you can see the same thing. The glass can be half empty or the glass can be half full. But you at least have to say, yes, it is water in the glass. And now where do we go from there? So I think that we know what the path has to be on both revenue and spending, on entitlements. We know that there are big baskets of challenges. But I think it's going to take an enormous amount of personal effort. That's the only way it ever works. And you're going to have partners on the other side who are willing to take risks with you and then go out and defend what they have done. One of the biggest problems when you're in politics is if you end up voting for or against something, you should have made a well-informed enough vote that you feel confident defending it, because even if people disagree with you, they will respect you for taking that position. And what happens too often, if you get somebody into making what for them is a politically risky vote, At the first sign of doubt, they run for cover, and they lose doubly. They will lose on the substance of the vote, but then they will lose even more because they haven't stood their ground and defended the choice they made. So I think there's a lot of work that goes into trying to get to the discussion that you referred to about how to make these hard choices.
It's always harder to defend a political vote than a vote of conscience. And you're right. So now I'm going to ask you a personal question. So I think I know something about you that very few people know. Is it true that you were once a Slimer?
Yes. Yes. I often say it's the job I have that best prepared me for Washington.
Would you like to describe what a Slimer is?
Yes. After I graduated from college, I was going to law school in the fall, and I wanted a different experience. So a group of friends and I drove to Alaska. We went up the Alcan before it was paved. We had no money. We were just kind of camping out and taking odd jobs as we went. I washed dishes in Valdez in the Denali National Park. It was called McKinley National Park. But one of the jobs that I had was working at a fishery, so that as the salmon were brought in and dumped on the dock, they were slit open and the caviar taken out by some expert workers from Japan. Then they were thrown into a big pile, and my job, being given hip boots and a spoon, was to clean out everything else on the inside. That's what a Slimer did. And so, being, the diligent student that I've been through most of my life, I would take it, open it up, and then they were screaming at me in Japanese because I wasn't going fast enough. So I tried to pick up the speed and get the salmon cleaned out, get them slimed. Then I got kicked upstairs because I wasn't fast enough. And I was packing, and there was a sort of primitive assembly line, and you were supposed to be packing head, tail, head, tail, head, tail, and get it down the assembly line. And I'm doing it, and I know nothing about salmon. But a lot of, I saw colors of salmon that I didn't think were natural. And I was getting worried that I was packing these black and blue salmon and these odd shades of yellow. And so I went to the plant manager and I said, these don't look right to me. He goes, what do you know? I said, well, I don't know anything except they don't look right. He goes, go back and work. By now it was like Thursday, and I kept during the day saying, and he said, look, don't worry about it. It's not your job to worry about it. And finally I caused so much of a commotion because I kept saying, they look sick, they don't look healthy, that he fired me. And then as he was firing me, I said, well, I worked for 4 days. And he said, well, come back tomorrow and I'll pay you for your 4 days. And I said, okay. So next day I go back, the entire operation is gone. So that was an experience on many different levels.
So we were talking backstage about the biopharmaceutical industry, and I was explaining to you that it costs $1.2 to $1.5 billion to bring a drug to market. It's one of the riskiest ventures. These people are incredible risk takers and entrepreneurs. Most of their projects fail, and most of the drugs that are approved by the FDA never pay for themselves. As I was saying to you, every country, every state wants us to come and set up because they want the jobs, they want the benefits. They don't want to pay for them. They believe that our prices are too high and they want to drive them down. You can't be engaged in the riskiest, highest risk endeavor and not have high reward. The economics don't work. And it's a dilemma for us. So, what are your thoughts about that? What do you think we should do?
Well, I'm by no means an expert. I recognize the dilemma. And earlier I saw Governor Brown was here, and Governor Patrick was here, and of course my friend Terry McAuliffe, Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, was here. And I happen to believe that those three governors are very thoughtful, creative policymakers. And I do think that this is going to become an increasing challenge for the domestic industry, because I think what we'll see is more and more state capitalism, state-owned businesses, very large guarantees coming from other countries, not just the tax system, which has its own issues, but real subsidization for these kinds of risky enterprises outside of our country. If we don't come up with some sensible solutions that continue to encourage and incentivize risk-taking and figure out what the appropriate balance is for the reward side, and of course the cost to healthcare. And one of the ideas that I know people have been trying to come to grips with, is there any way in our system to embed some kind of foundational, for want of a better word, sort of insurance against risk that could be affordable and could be available to all of you who do this important work. I think we should have the kind of intensive discussion, and maybe if Washington right now is not particularly welcoming to this kind of effort, maybe it could be put together by a lot of the states that are the leaders in hosting biotech companies. The tax issue is something else. Clearly, I believe we've got to rationalize our tax system, because I don't want to see biotech companies or pharma companies moving out of our country simply because of some kind of perceived tax disadvantage and potential tax advantage somewhere else. So I would very much favor, and I'm sure that I saw Francis Collins earlier, I'm sure that the science leadership in our government would be very interested in engaging in this, obviously the regulatory side. So Jim, maybe there is a way to get a representative group of actors at the table to start really going through this. It is a dilemma, because if you can't get quickly enough to a broad enough market, and some drugs by definition are never going to have a broad market because of what you are targeting, but for generalization purposes, if you can't get to a broad market quickly so that you can get price down and volume up, so that you are going to get a return on the investment you've made, then you're in a problematic area for your own investors and for your fiscal feasibility. On the other hand, if you invest all this money, and as Jim said, you don't get through clinical trials, you don't get approval, so you've got all these sunk costs, which could mean the end of your business, but you still have expertise that might be useful. How do we take advantage of that? I just think we ought to have a careful analysis of all of the issues, and frankly the many sub-issues, and begin to talk about, are there win-win solutions that we can bring to the table? How do we work with the states? What role can they play? California did a very important task in creating a funding stream for stem cell research. Other states have followed suit when it looked as though the federal government would not be doing that. So states have a role to play, but we need a national framework. And I would certainly hope that this industry association, working, maybe starting with governors like the ones I mentioned and others, and reaching out to the appropriate experts in the federal government, to begin to come up with some solutions, because otherwise I'm afraid too many people are going to leave, and then we're going to be facing competition from what we've nurtured, but we're also going to be facing competition that is state-based and state-underwritten, which causes a whole set of new problems for us.
In your book, in Hard Choices, you wrote, climate change represents both a significant national security threat and a major test of American leadership. Many of our companies are in the biofuels business. A lot of it is driven with cellulosic ethanol. We believe this is a critical part of changing the greenhouse gas problem, reducing emissions. And yet, as you know, once again, there's pure political debate. A lot of the sides are very, very dug in. The conservatives are absolutely convinced that this is all a hoax. And the rest of us truly worry for the and having the ability to plan. How would you help? You know, you've talked about gaining trust, but this is a tough one to dug in ideologically. How would you deal with that?
Well, I think first you have to separate out those who are dug in ideologically from those who are taking advantage and fueling a debate for their commercial and economic interests, because those are not always the same. I think a lot of the confusion that exists in the public arena and even in the policy-making world is not scientific based, it's not ideological based, it's sort of raw politics that is fed by large financial interests who believe, I think wrongly, but who believe that the short-term cost to their industry is greater than any long-term benefit that they, frankly, their family, or even our world could receive. So here I think that we have to do what President Obama is doing now. Within his executive authority, he has to take steps, as he recently did on the regulations for coal-fired plants, recognizing that states are at different stages of development, so that if you're starting at a low base where you haven't done very much to clean up the air, to deal with old plants, to come in with an alternative suite of energy products, then you've got to do more, but you're given more time to do it. If you're a state like California or Massachusetts that have been real leaders, then your burden is different. So I think that if you look at the plan, it is a good start on dealing with one continuing source of greenhouse gas emissions. But while that's going on, we have direct challenges to alternatives coming from those who are commercially and politically opposed. They're trying to get states to do away with or refuse to renew their credits for renewables, their cooperative programs with utilities, so that if you have solar or wind, geothermal, the utility buys it from you and puts it into the grid. So there's a rearguard action. While we haven't done enough to progress, we have those behind us who are trying to undo what we have done. And the irony is that we know that we can make a lot of progress in what's already established technology, like wind, for example. You know, there are a couple of states, Texas being one, in the top 3 that are getting a significant percentage of their electricity now from wind. So everybody is acting in an almost political form of schizophrenia. They're doing some things that make it positive for us to deal with climate change, but they're also falling back into either bad habits of denial for political purposes, or they are giving way to political and economic pressures. So on this one too, Jim, I think that the recent proposal that Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary for George W. Bush, Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer here in California recently made about having business do the risk analysis and building it into your base is an important step that could, I think, raise the issues in a way that maybe would be harder for politicians to ignore. The insurance industry has run a lot of these risk analyses. They know very well that on the East Coast, Norfolk, Virginia is in real peril. And therefore, they are already talking with local governments and big real estate holders on the East Coast, from the Carolinas down to Miami, about mitigation. So the more we can inject real life issues, problems that are going to have to be addressed sooner instead of later, while we're still trying to build a coalition that overpowers the ideological and checkmates the political and economic opponents, the more we can try to move forward. And it's imperative that we do, because the United States has to be seen as a leader here at home for us to influence what's going on globally. I have a chapter in the book about the Copenhagen conference that I attended and that the president joined me at, and it's around an incident that was so symbolic, because we were trying to get developing countries led by China and India to sign on to mitigation efforts. And they were taking a position that they didn't have to do anything because they were still not developed enough, and this was all the responsibility of the West. And we had been making this case for a year since I became Secretary of State and with my expert team, and we wanted to try to get to some agreement, just a baby step, but something that would move that debate forward. We couldn't find the Chinese, or the Indians, or the South Africans, or the Brazilians. We were told they all left. And the President and I were looking at each other like, what do you mean they left? How could they have left? The conference isn't over yet. And we sent out scouts to this big convention center in Copenhagen. We said, go find them. They got to be here somewhere. They found them hiding literally up the stairs in the back of one of the wings, holding a private meeting behind curtained windows. So the President looks at me, I look at the President, and he's thinking what I'm thinking, we go crash the meeting. And it was like, it was the pedestrian equivalent of a motorcade, we called it a footcade. We started marching through the convention center, up the stairs. The Chinese guards are saying, no, 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 and we're saying, hi, hi, hi. And we're kind of ducking under arms and around bodies, and finally we get to the door, and again, arm is out, and the President just pushes through, and I go under. We say, hi, we've been looking for you. And we sat down and began to talk. And this is so critical that the United States be at literally every table, but we won't have credibility unless we're able to say, we're taking some tough steps. We did some mileage work with cars, we did coal-fired plants. The Supreme Court just thankfully upheld the right of the administration to move forward on regulating greenhouse gases. There isn't any international issue with a longer tail in terms of what we need to be addressing right now. So I think we have to keep at it, and there needs to be more of a sense of urgency and more conversations, and we have to get over this false equivalency. The press has not done us any services because you have 98% of the scientists in the world agreeing that man has caused much of this problem. And whenever the press covers it in most of the settings, they will have somebody who represents the overwhelming scientific opinion, then they'll have somebody who basically says no, and they say, well, that's the debate. It isn't the debate. The debate is settled. What is not settled is what we're going to do about the debate. And whether we're going to take responsibility.
You travel the world and you see the devastating impact of hunger and famine. You know what the world population is headed to. You've spoken extensively about food security and how farmers need better seeds, particularly drought-resistant seeds, fertilizers, and technologies. A lot of our companies, of course, are in agricultural biotechnology. 90% of the corn, cotton, and soy in this country is GMO. It's used extensively throughout the world. And every credible scientific analysis that this is safe, it's committed. And yet we face, I think Mr. Cortez is out here today, unrelenting onslaught. It is anti-science. And frankly, although we love organic farmers and all of that, this fight is largely funded by people who have an economic interest in making GMO the boogeyman, so frankly they can charge 2 or 3 times more for their products. What do you stand on this?
Well, I stand in favor of using seeds and products that have a proven track record that you say, and I agree, is scientifically provable, and continue to try to make the case to those who are skeptical that they may not know what they're eating already, because the question of genetically modified food or hybrids has gone on for many, many years. And there is, again, a big gap between what the facts are and what the perceptions are. And what I have seen is, when we talk about drought-resistant seeds, and I've promoted those all over Africa, by definition, they have been engineered to be drought-resistant. I mean, that's the beauty of them. And maybe somebody can get their harvest done and not starve, and maybe have some left over to sell. And yet, I've been involved in a lot of the political debates in other countries about whether or not to accept certain kinds of seeds. And what we did in the time I was in the State Department was to begin to switch our efforts away from emergency feeding, which we had done to great extent, and it still is very necessary, but really since the 1980s, our food aid was not being used in a way to help farmers do better for themselves. And a lot of people thought it wasn't possible because soil was deficient. There were all kinds of problems in trying to convince smallholder farmers, of whom there are so many, to work together. And we created a program called Feed the Future, which was trying to help farmers be educated enough to know that drought-resistant seeds, for example, are not going to hurt them, not going to hurt their property, not going to hurt their people, their family. And this is painstaking work. This doesn't get solved overnight. We have to be working at the top with departments of agriculture and finance ministries and prime ministers and presidents' offices, and you have to be working from the bottom up. I don't see any shortcut for it. And I think that if we were to try to link aid, for example, or trade to governments passing laws to be more open or just eliminating by fiat their concerns, that would backfire. So it's a painstaking, almost farmer by farmer, government by government effort. But we certainly tried to change the calculations so that people understood better what we were talking about. I mean, genetically modified sounds Frankensteinish. Drought resistance sounds really something you want. So how do you create a different vocabulary to talk about what it is you're trying to help people do? And that I would encourage the association and companies working in this area to really try to be more thoughtful about, so that you don't raise that red flag immediately.
And what we confront is the tactics of our opponents are about labeling. And here in California, we have a big statewide referendum on labeling. And labeling sounds like it's an easy argument. What do you have to hide about the labeling? Well, there's no information in the labeling that says this is genetically modified. It gives the consumer any useful information whatsoever. It becomes a tactic to then create scare. So you don't need to answer that. I want to let's travel the planet a little bit. And let's of course start with Iraq. Where things are spinning out of control. The administration is trying to decide what to do, and one of the questions is, should we make common cause with Iran? Strange bedfellow indeed. What do you think?
Well, I think that it's important to put this in the context of what actually happened, because I followed some of the commentary and it's getting somewhat confused. George W. Bush's administration negotiated with the Iraqis a timeline for the withdrawal of American troops, the end of 2011. That was already in place when President Obama came into office and I became Secretary of State. And what that meant then was, in order to have any continuing American presence, it had to be negotiated and accepted by the Iraqis, because the other agreement had been signed by both governments and was in effect. So I was part of trying to figure out what would we offer to the Iraqis, what would we want to do, and what would they accept. And basically, we went through a number of different possibilities. And what our offer really was, we can help you with training, we can help you with intelligence gathering and analysis, but we're not going to be involved in combat. That is not going to be our continuing role. And we began to negotiate with the Iraqis, and in order to have American troops on the ground in any kind of numbers, you have to negotiate what's called a status of forces agreement, where the other country agrees that our soldiers will have immunity from local prosecution, that they will be able to be in the country but be under military, U.S. military authority. That's what we have all over the world, where we have any significant number of troops. And at the end of the day, the Iraqis would not accept that. And therefore, we could not stay. And we did not. We have a very large embassy there. In fact, by some measures, it is the largest in the world. We had some trainers, and we had a lot of contractors, often former military, who were doing that training. So fast forward, one of the biggest problems was when we left, because of lack of agreement, we thought we had certain commitments from Maliki and his government. One was to continue paying the Sunni awakening forces. Remember when General Petraeus was commander in Iraq and President Bush sent additional American troops, what really turned the tide were the Sunni tribal chiefs who began to get disgusted with al-Qaeda in Iraq and began to work with the Americans against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And they basically formed militias that were part of what was called the Sunni Awakening, and Maliki agreed that these men would continue being paid. He reneged on that. He also agreed that he would have an inclusive government, namely Sunnis would be given high-ranking positions. And even though some were put into these positions, it wasn't too long before he began charging them with all kinds of crimes and other misbehaviors, driving them away, including driving one vice president out of the country because of threatened charges against him. And so the promise of, yes, we have to have a more inclusive government, you're not going to keep Iraq together, you don't have representation from Sunnis and Kurds as well as Shiites. He began agreeing on all of that. So the ground was laid for a lot of discontent. Now meanwhile, the Kurds up in the north are putting together an economy. They are making deals with foreign oil companies, including some of our own. They're opening the border to a lot of trade with Turkey. So they are building a stable social system, and they're engaging in a lot more economic activity and a sort of nascent democracy. But what we saw was that the alienation of the Sunni leadership and rank and file became fertile ground for the creation of the so-called ISIS, which was sort of bred in Syria during the rebellion against Assad, but which was always linked closely to Iraq and closely to the Sunni areas in Iraq. So now, part of what is going on is to try to get Maliki, if he will, to make some of the changes and to do it in a way that will inspire Sunni support so that we can form that coalition again between the Iraqi government and Sunni sheikhs who will be fighting with them against ISIS. Whether that will happen, I really don't know. And then you add the ingredient of Iran, and we know that probably Assad has survived as long as he has because of Iranian support, direct support, military support, financial support, combined with support and fighting members from Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is, for all intents and purposes, in this arena, a proxy of Iran, as well as Russian cash and support. But the Iranians have made it clear they will do whatever it takes to support Maliki. And in fact, the head of what's called the Quds Force, which is a special part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Qasem Soleimani, was in Baghdad, we know, working to try to figure out how Iranian advisors and special forces and others will help the Shiites. So my point has been the United States should not be committed to doing very much at all unless we have a clearer understanding of what Maliki is going to do and what role Iran is going to play. I think the President sent a contingent of forces of 300 who are experts in areas that would give us a better view of what was really happening But right now, unless the political situation changes so that the Sunnis feel they have a future, and frankly, I don't think that can happen with Maliki, and I've said this publicly, I don't think he will make the personal commitment to deliver. So then the Iraqis will have to pick someone else if they reach the same conclusion. So the politics of this are complicated, but without some kind of political resolution, I don't think there can be a successful operation against ISIS. And I don't think we want to be supporting only one side, and I don't think we want to be in the same arena with the Iranians until we know what that means. And I'm sitting here today and have no idea what that would mean, but I don't think it's necessarily in our interest to be seen that way. So there's a lot of unanswered questions before I would be in favor of doing anything more than what the President has already agreed to.
Someone said that there's an inevitability to our bombing Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, that they will never be able to resolve a solution. They are hell-bent on having a nuclear arsenal, and that is absolutely unacceptable eventuality in the first place.
Well, I write a lot about this because I want people to understand how we got Iran to the negotiating table, because when I became secretary, I found two very troubling situations that I confronted. One, as Jim said, Iran, it appeared to us from our intelligence, was moving straight ahead toward producing a nuclear weapon and working to get it miniaturized and making its missile system sophisticated enough for it all to be deliverable. And that the rest of the world was just somewhat pessimistic that anything could be done. So what the President and I did was a two-track strategy of pressure and engagement. And the idea was that we could get an international consensus that would produce sanctions from the Security Council that would be enforced internationally. We could see an increase in economic pressure on the Iranian government that might change their calculus, that could lead them to the negotiating table. And I write about how we do that and how complicated it is. And in fact, I found myself in Lima, Peru, negotiating the last pieces of the Security Council resolution with the ambassador from China to the United States, who happened to be there, and we could meet and do that. So we get the sanctions passed, and then we had to implement them, and it was very difficult. It was difficult both for substance. A lot of Southern European countries got a lot of their oil and gas from Iran, and a lot of Asian countries, India, South Korea, Japan, certainly China did as well, so convincing them to cut supplies. And there were a lot of fortuitous developments, like the increase in domestic energy production here, which took other production away from needing to come to the United States, so that would then be available. So it was very complicated. We get to the point where the sanctions are clearly biting, but the regime led by Ahmadinejad is not moving. The Iranian people saw that themselves. They voted in Rouhani, and Rouhani was given the green light to test negotiations. And so in these negotiations, we have a much better idea of what they have. We have a clearer sense of how committed they are to pursuing this, despite what is a fatwa against nuclear weapons that has been repeatedly issued by the Supreme Leader. And there is an opening for an enforceable agreement. Having said that, this is really hard. I was the one who began to explore this when I was there by sending one of my trusted aides to Oman to meet secretly with Iranian representatives to begin to discuss what could be possible. And we put together a long planning process, and then with the Rouhani election, shortly after I left, we were able to hold the first negotiating session. So sitting here today, Jim, I think we have done what we should have done, which was to pursue in every way possible and to bring together the international community around that goal, having a negotiation with the Iranians. But we can't make a deal that is not enforceable. As we often say, no deal is better than a bad deal. The initial deadline for reaching agreement is July 20th. I know there's discussions that have to be going on about extending that. So this is a really hard choice, because could we ever feel confident in saying this is an acceptable agreement? If we can, what truly is the alternative? And it is a very difficult choice indeed if the alternative is to take some kind of military action for all kinds of reasons, consequences that are foreseen and unintended. So we're going to continue to push forward on the negotiating front. And I think the Iranians want a deal, but of course they want a deal on their terms. And we in the West, in the so-called P5+1, Security Council plus Germany, we want a deal. And I know well the sides of what they're trying to accomplish. So we'll see. But I hope we can reach a deal. And if we don't, then we're going to have to renew our efforts to put additional pressure to try to create a better environment for demonstrably ending their nuclear weapons.
China. It is a lender, it is a threat, it is a partner, it is a rival. How should we engage? What should be the principles of how we should engage in China? And what is the role of what we call smart diplomacy?
Well, one of the big surprises to me when I became secretary is I began making calls, and I knew a number of the leaders, some were of course new to me. But what I heard in Asia from a lot of my counterparts, foreign ministers, and even some of the Thai ministers I spoke with, was a deep concern that the prior 8 years, because of our concentration after 9/11 on the Middle East, on South Asia, made our Asian friends and allies feel that they were no longer important to the United States. So over and over I would hear, is the United States still committed to being an Asian Pacific power? Are you going to be re-engaging with us? And that's why I made my first trip as Secretary of State in February of 2009 to Asia. And of course went to our treaty allies, Japan and South Korea, but also to Indonesia and to China, and I went back many times. I think we want what we described when I was there between the Chinese government and ourselves. We want a positive and comprehensive, cooperative relationship. That doesn't mean we don't have differences, because we do. But it means that we will work very hard to resolve those differences and to avoid confrontation, conflict for even a worse scenario. And that's what we did when we created something called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue that the Treasury Secretary and I chaired, was to make a much broader commitment to government consultation between us so that we can make progress, or at least push forward on intellectual property, on food safety, on clean energy, a lot of the areas where we could perhaps come up with agreements as to what we could do cooperatively. Now, we disagree on a number of important issues, the South China Sea being a prime example. So there's no substitute for strategic patience, but there's also no substitute for deep engagement. And it is my very strong conviction that here too we have to build relationships. I write in the book about the incident of the blind dissident, Chen Guangcheng, who escaped from house arrest, wanted to be given refuge in the American embassy. I was asked to make a decision literally in a split second, and it was a very difficult one because I knew it would not be well received by the Chinese government, but I also knew our values were very much at stake. So I said, go get him. We brought him into the embassy and we began a long negotiation with the Chinese that led to him and his immediate family getting out. Now, I tell that story because it was about a week before I was supposed to be in China for our annual strategic and economic dialogue. We had a lot of business to deal with. But we had invested, and I personally had invested a lot of time with my counterparts, State Councilor Dubois and Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi and others, so that I had a relationship with them. They knew me, I knew them, and we had a couple of really disastrous moments in that negotiation that we had to recover from. But we also believed that the relationship was too important to allow it to go off the rails. And that has to continue to be our goal. Despite our disagreements and despite standing up and making clear those disagreements, we have to look for ways to work together. And I'm worried about Northeast Asia. The rhetoric between Japan and China over the contested islands is troubling. What's happening off of Vietnam with the Chinese claiming areas that look to be certainly within Vietnam's territorial waters, the standoffs with the Philippines. There are a lot of potential hot spots. So it's important for the United States to keep a cool head and to be involved and to be doing all we can to persuade China to be what has been called a responsible stakeholder, to be part of the global-based rules that should govern strategic and economic activities. So I think we have to be in it for the long haul, and we have to be using what I call smart power. Every tool in our national security toolbox, not just our military, which obviously is a big tool, but diplomatic efforts, development efforts, cultural, and all the rest.
Russia, Ukraine, Putin. Another easy one.
Another easy one, yeah.
What does Putin want in terms of not only geography, but what does he want in terms of relationship with the U.S.?
Well, I had the interesting experience of working first with President Medvedev and actually getting things done, like the Iranian sanctions getting through the National Security Council. And then having Putin come back into power with his announcement in the fall of 2011 that he would become president again and Medvedev become prime minister. I mean, you gotta love that version of politics. I mean, it's so clean and doesn't cause any fuss. Nobody has to campaign for anything. Just get on a stage and make an announcement.
Something we could do on the stage.
Yeah, well,